America, it's time for some straight talk. You love your phone. Look at you. You hardly put it down. But you don't love that expensive wireless plan, do you? So what if I told you can keep that phone, network, and number 2 for a lot less? Well, this is me telling you, it's time to switch to Straight Talk, guys. Bring your own phone and get unlimited plans starting at just $45 a month on America's largest, most dependable 4G LTE networks. Straight Talk Wireless, only at Walmart.
Savings may vary. Please refer always to the latest terms and conditions of service at straighttalk.com.
This is the Best of Mike and Mike podcast. Subscribe now by going to the Listen tab in the ESPN app.
The Best of Mike and Mike.
Here we are. We're back and better than ever. Mike and Mike, presented by Progressive Insurance. Our guests on the Shell Pennzoil Performance Line, and the hits, they just keep on coming. The NBA offseason has more than made up for everything the playoffs lacked in drama and chaos and intrigue. Chris Paul is a rocket. The reasons why are fascinating, and Paul George may be headed to town right behind him. Mike Golic Jr. is in the chair this morning, and this is going to be a lot of fun. And I want to start with a question that has been sort of rattling around in my mind over the course of the last couple of weeks, and that is, Mike, have we now reached a point in sports where the most interesting times of the calendar year are the times when the games themselves are not being played?
Absolutely, especially in the NBA. The NBA teams to me right now are like a bunch of drunk toddlers trying to put together a puzzle because they're just grabbing the biggest, best pieces they can get and trying to jam them together in ways that don't seem to make sense right now. Maybe the picture becomes clearer when more of the pieces fall into place, but right now that's the entertainment value, is watching them all slug away to try and get to the Golden State mountaintop.
The two separate thoughts I have on that analogy. One of them is I absolutely love it. The second is we probably could lose either half of it. Like, I don't know that we want drunk toddlers. Do you know what I'm saying?
Yeah, well,
you could have just toddlers in general who probably are just grabbing the biggest piece that they see.
Yes, they could.
And then, or just, drunk people who.
Could be. For some reason, the combination of words right there was really pleasing, made a ton of sense in my head. Now I realize probably kind of reprehensible when you throw that out there to a normal, polite society.
And yet I loved it, and it probably does make all the sense in the world. And there is a fear that I have with this, though. Look, we have this fabulous arms race that is going on now in the NBA where it started with the Miami Heat and LeBron. I understand there have been super teams before. I understand that people want to say, hey, LeBron, there were super teams in the 60s, but that was a totally different concept in every conceivable way. The way those teams are constructed, the way it worked out, and the fact that one team wound up being great did not make them a super team. I have created my own new definition of super team. Your father and I actually argued over the semantics of this far longer than we should have.
No, I heard. I was made fully aware of that argument, so I'm glad you guys hashed that out.
Which side of that do you fall on, by the way? Because to me, there are two separate things. There's a super team, and then there's a super team. The Boston Celtics of the 60s, led by Bill Russell, were a super team. They were the greatest team of all time relative to their competition. No one will ever do what they did. Even these Warriors aren't going to do what those teams did. To me, the concept of the super team is in the construct. The super team to me is where, like, you're into superheroes and all that kind of stuff, right? Like, so those, they all come together on purpose, right? They look at each other and say,
you put together the Avengers. That's a super team. You bring all of these outside heroes together from all the different narrative parts, and you make them a super team.
Exactly.
Absolutely.
Now, if someone was actually, like, drafting them and constructing them from free agency separately from them, that wouldn't fit my definition. My definition is they're choosing to come together.
Yes, they're choosing to come together. Perfect superhero analogy for you. Think of the Avengers versus the Fantastic Four. They were all there when the radiation hit them at the same time when you're the Fantastic Four. You became that group together. That was natural, as unnatural as getting hit with space radiation is.
Right, exactly. So that was which one again? The Fantastic Four?
That was Fantastic Four.
So the Bulls of the 90s and the Celtics of the 80s and the Lakers of the 80s and the Spurs of you want to call it the last 20 years, those teams were the Fantastic Four. I'm talking about the Avengers, teams that put themselves together. And so that's LeBron and the guys in the Heat. And then the Warriors have now taken that to an even bigger level. And now the Rockets are trying to compete with that. And I can't blame them at all. You have two choices in the NBA right now. You can roll over or you can try and make a move. So the Rockets are going for it. My concern is, how close are we right now, Mike Golic Jr., to having four teams in the NBA that have all of the good players, and everybody else is the Washington Generals?
I think we're pretty close to that, but I think it's what's happened throughout the entire history of the NBA. And watching that 30 for 30, the best of enemies, was enlightening to me as someone who didn't live through those eras of basketball, of just seeing the way that teams have always tried to sort of fudge the rules in favor of what they can do to make themselves the best, and then everyone else adjusts. It's called the Red Queen theory in evolution, that you're essentially running in the same, you have to keep running faster to get to the same place in order to just keep up with everyone else. And that's the NBA arms race right now. We'll get to that point where you've got larger collections of talent, and it'll even everything out. Water will find its level, so to speak, in all of this. It's just that right now we're at that zenith. We're at that first one through the wall where it seems like this is an impossible thing to overcome, and it's going to be doom and gloom on the other side. The rules have been constantly changing in the NBA. Everyone's just figuring out the best way to keep up with that.
I get it, and I don't blame anybody for doing it. Their job is to do the best they can to win. Adam Silver and his office's job is to figure out a way to maintain some level of competitive balance. And the one thing that you didn't see in that I can tell anyone who wasn't old enough to have been around in the 80s and watched it, and the Celtics and the Lakers were the dominant teams, no question, but Julius Erving on the Sixers wasn't trying to figure out a way to get to Boston. And Bernard King on the Knicks wasn't trying to figure out a way to get to Los Angeles. And all the guys on the Lakers weren't trying to recruit George Gervin away from San Antonio. Do you know what I mean? There were still great players spread out across the league, and those teams just were the best of a group of good teams, as opposed to all of the players are either now going to be on Golden State, San Antonio, Houston, and Cleveland, or they'll be trying to figure out a way to get to Golden State, Cleveland, San Antonio, and Houston.
And I'd say the counter to that is still some of what we saw early in this NBA playoffs. I mean, Memphis, they're devoid of a lot of traditional superstars, but they made a compelling series early in this playoffs against the San Antonio Spurs. I'd argue, again, the NBA made Milwaukee interesting during the NBA playoffs, and you can thank Giannis for that. But that's still a compelling superstar in that market. You've got the Sixers and the Timberwolves right now in less traditional, less big markets that at least have compelling stars. You talk about the interest in the offseason. It's that we've got huge names all over the place in the NBA. And those teams might not be competitive, but right now we're peddling in hope. That's what we do in the offseasons. That's why they're great.
Right.
So you've got hope in Philadelphia and Minnesota and Milwaukee and all these places that they might just be tangent to a Cleveland Cavaliers team with LeBron James that's finally showing a little bit of a crack in the armor.
Yeah. Actually, Philadelphia and Minnesota, I think, have legitimate reason for hope. And that is good news. Let's see if they're able to keep those teams together. All right, let's start it with off the top here. Mike Golic Jr. with you today. And the Rockets have acquired Chris Paul from the Clippers in exchange for 7 players and draft picks and money going back and forth. And we'll get more deeply into this in a second here, Mike. But the bottom line of it is Chris Paul wanted out of L.A. And the reasons why, we're going to hear from one of our SportsCenter colleagues here, they could wind up being very interesting.
Yeah, it's more of the melodrama that we've come to expect from the NBA as far as what you get on the court. You get to pair him up with the runner-up in the MVP in James Harden, who was all-time in usage this year. Now, James Harden and Chris Paul will be 2 of the only 4 players in the NBA, including LeBron James and Kevin Durant, to be named first-team All-NBA in at least 3 times in the last 6 seasons. So that's the kind of firepower you've got mounting up in Houston, and we hear that they might be in the market to add even more.
Right, exactly right. They may be going after Paul George coming up next. Paul led the Clippers to a winning record and a playoff appearance in all 6 of his seasons in Los Angeles. In the 27 seasons the Clippers played before he got there, they made the playoffs only 4 times. And they have the worst winning percentage in the NBA. A lot of people, Mike, like to knock Chris Paul because he's never gotten out of the second round, and they use that to try to diminish his greatness. He has numbers, regular season at least numbers, that suggest he's one of the greatest point guards that ever lived. Where do you fall on that spectrum between he's completely overrated, his teams never win in the playoffs, or his numbers suggest he's one of the greatest players ever?
I tend to side with the numbers just because I think a lot of times in team sports we use results too much as the metric for judging success and how good someone is as a player. And so I never had any problem with Chris Paul. My question is now, as the Clippers look to lock up Blake Griffin in the wake of all of this, is he enough on his own? Is Blake Griffin a guy that you can legitimately build around in today's NBA? And I just don't think so.
Right. I think, unfortunately, there isn't any one player with the super teams we're talking about that you could build around, with the possible exception of LeBron James, and as we saw this year, maybe even he is not enough. All right, Aaron Judge hit another home run last night, his 27th of the season as the Yankees beat the White Sox 12-3. He's 1 home run shy of tying Mark McGwire's record for most home runs by a rookie through the end of June. Let me ask you this question, Mike Golic Jr. Is there anything in baseball right now that makes you stop what you're doing and pay attention more than Aaron Judge coming to the plate.
No, and it's the best thing possible for the sport. I said I miss the era that I grew up in baseball that had Mark McGwire and Sosa and Barry Bonds, and all of these guys were cutting into the broadcast of these games, and you were making it appointment viewing. And I did that for the first time in a long time the other night because I knew Judge was up to bat, and you have the chance to see something legitimately great and awe-inspiring every time this guy is on your screen.
In the late, I'm just doing the math in my head, in the late 90s, you would have been 10, 11, 12-ish years old. So the McGwire, Sosa, Bonds, home run.
The steroid era was the heart of my childhood in baseball.
And that's what you, in your mind, that's what baseball is, right? That's what you grew up with. That's what you expected to be, and you liked it.
I got a home run race. I had Barry Bonds chasing the all-time record. I had all of these things that are now looked back on with a little bit of a side eye, a wink and a nudge, but that were the foundation of my baseball fandom. And I feel like coming into it from that to where we've been lately has been a bit of a letdown.
Well, you want home runs?
Off the top.
I got one for you. Tim Tebow hit one last night. Homered in his second game with the St. Lucie Mets. How closely, if at all, are you following Tebow's progress in the minor leagues?
Not closely at all, but it's one we know anytime something like this comes up, he's going to make the news because he's that polarizing a star. We talk about this with the NBA stars. He's a guy that's a legitimate, proven commodity as far as a household name. Is there any way we can petition for him in the home run derby? Could you imagine Judge, Giancarlo Stanton, and Tim Tebow coming to a derby near you?
It's actually a very, very good idea. Get Rob Manfred on the phone, Hembo. Let's get that done. And finally, speaking of baseball, Miguel Montero, designated for assignment, sent down by the Mets after he gave up 7 stolen bases the other night and then very publicly blamed his pitcher. He did say he called Jake Arrieta to apologize, and Arrieta's response was basically, hey, man, heat of the moment, we're all good here. Give me a quick take on what you heard from Montero the other day and your thoughts on him getting sent down.
Well, I think Anthony Rizzo, who went on later and commented on air calling it selfish, was absolutely right. Catcher's one of those positions, and I'd almost liken it to offensive line, where no one wants to hear about your problems. And you're not there to complain about your problems. That's one of the positions that you have the closest proximity to the money. You're closest to the pitcher, you're closest to the quarterback, you're closest to the goalie, wherever you are. You're there to be the meat shield, as I've often said. And that's both in a literal sense and in this sense right here, where you're asked to stand up and sometimes take the blames for things that aren't your fault. And when you balk from that model, you look petty. You look exactly like this has looked.
That's very well put.
Off the top.
That's a very good analogy. And that's Off the Top with Mike and Mike. It's what everyone's talking about, brought to you by O'Reilly Auto Parts. Better parts, better prices every day. It's a good analogy to the offensive line, which, of course, for those who don't know, Mike Golic Jr., this was a position that you played at Notre Dame. And the reason that I think of that is I remember there was a playoff game where Peyton Manning got sacked multiple times. I forget what it was. They lost a tough game, a game they were favored to win back when he was in Indianapolis. And after the game, it sounded like he kept referring to, well, we were having trouble in protection and we were having difficulty with the blitz. And it sounded like he was throwing his offensive line under the bus. And everyone came to his defense. Everyone came and said, no, he's talking about himself as well. He's putting himself in with the group. If an offensive lineman were to say similar things, well, Peyton was having trouble picking up the reads, Peyton was having trouble getting us in the right places, whatever the case may be, the world would have come down on them very differently.
Exactly. It's my personal vendetta now as a former offensive lineman to point out inaccuracies in protection when it's brought up on broadcast, because a lot of time people attribute sacks to the offensive line that don't belong there. Running backs and tight ends are involved in protection. As you mentioned, the quarterback plays a role in setting that a lot of times, but that's for you once you're done. When you're in that role, you go up there and you assume blame for the things. You talk about it in the sense of we, because it's a collective, and usually even err on the side of I. If Miguel Montoya had gone up there and said, you know what, I have to wear that as the catcher, the buck stops with me. It's my job to go out there and cover up for those things when they come up, and I have to assume that. That's what you're asked to do, because when it comes out on the other side, you're right. Even if you're right, even in the truest part of this, if you are correct in what you're saying, it's never going to come off that way. It's always going to be sour grapes.
I agree, and we did a thing yesterday, and I'm not sorry that we did it. Hembo went in there with a stopwatch, and he's timing the move to the plate all night long and coming up with how many of the steals, and I think he just likes doing that stuff, but how many of the steals were and weren't Montero's fault, and my feeling was it's a delightful exercise, but it's an irrelevant waste of time, because regardless of whether he's right or wrong, to the point that you are making, he shouldn't have said it either way. You don't say that even if he's 100% right. Even if Arrieta doesn't let go of the ball until the runner has already begun his slide into second, At that point, Montero has to take the blame.
Exactly. Even if the running back completely whiffs, it's my job to say, you know what, I could have gotten him help. I could have been there late. I could have done something. We have to do a better job overall holding up and making sure we keep that clean. He has to do a better job here of making sure they don't give up 7 stolen bases in a night.
We're Mike and Mike. We're presented by Progressive Insurance. Last year, over 3 million drivers switched to Progressive. Call or click today. Find out if you could save. This may be an impossible question, and today definitely isn't the day to get into it. We'll get to Chris Paul in a second. But roughly speaking, what percentage of sacks in a football game, major college football or an NFL game, are the simple product of a defensive lineman beating an offensive lineman, one-on-one blocking, and I'm the D lineman, you're the O line, I just beat you when I get to the quarterback, versus some kind of mistake, whether it's, you were supposed to get him, no, I was supposed to get him, no, the back was supposed to get him, no, the quarterback didn't have the right protection sliding the right way. Can you give a rough percentage of that?
I'd still say about half, because that's what football comes down to at the end of the day, is man versus man, me versus you. Now, there are other intricacies in that, but for the most part, it is that. But you will see, and it's usually very apparent when there is that miscommunication, when there is someone sliding the wrong way, when there is someone just blatantly blowing an assignment in a game. Usually those are the obvious ones. When it looks like it, when it smells like it, those are the obvious instances. But the rest of the time, protection is designed to give everyone help. That's the basis of team sports. You're designed to give everyone help somewhere, usually with the exception of one guy. And for the longest time, it was your left tackle. In a lot of instances, it can be your right guard. Those are the places where you usually see those one-on-one wins for a defensive lineman, because that's by design.
All right, Mike and Mike. Mike Golic Jr. in for Dad today. We got a lot to get to. Let's start with Chris Paul. He's on his way to Houston, where the Rockets are building a super team. That's what's going on here. Now, these guys... You could argue that this doesn't meet my definition because the Rockets engineered a trade here, but let's face it, this was Chris Paul deciding he wanted to go to Houston, going to the Clipper front office and saying, I'm going to go to Houston. Your best move here is to sign me, trade me there, and get something back as opposed to getting nothing back. So while you wake up this morning and you read the Clippers traded Chris Paul to Houston, do not be confused. This was CP3 and James Harden deciding they wanted to play together. Chris Paul had the ability and the leverage to get himself there, and that's what he did.
And to me, this is the most incredible part of this offseason, the last few offseasons with Kevin Durant, with everything LeBron James has engineered, is how much power these guys are going to continue to wield, because now they've all realized it. Now they all get that they have the ability to control all this. Chris Paul, better than anyone, is the head of the PA. He understands the inner workings of all this at a very intimate level. And so going forward, how much power are teams going to give these guys as you look in the new world order of the NBA? That's the interesting part. You've got the Doc Rivers that do both. You've got guys that have been coach and team president or coach and GM and all this stuff. When do we start seeing the players have a little more of those chips at the table?
Well, here's the bottom line. The NBA superstar, the really genuine A-level player in the National Basketball Association right now, with the possible exception of quarterbacks in the NFL, a handful of quarterbacks, are invaluable on a level that no other athlete is, because they make everything happen. They make the winning happen. They make the box office happen. They make the television ratings happen. In individual sports, you have people like that as well. We used to talk about the Tiger effect on television broadcasts. Yep. But those are by nature individual sports. Within team sports, a guy like Aaron Judge, for example, has set the world on fire. Clayton Kershaw, there'll be a little more of a walk-up on the nights that he's pitching versus other nights. But generally speaking, the game is not being totally changed by their presence. LeBron James, Kevin Durant, Chris Paul, you know the names. These guys, their power, the significance that they have within the sport is almost incalculable. You can't pay them enough money, no matter how much it is you're paying them. If you actually tried to figure out what LeBron James is worth, you would still be counting the money before you got
Well, and that's why we always talk about the way to stop the super team model is to remove that ceiling of what the top players can earn, because I'm with you. I've always wanted to know, what's that number? If you could really pay LeBron James his quarterback worth on the open market, what kind of price would he fetch? And what would it force you to do with the structure of the rest of your team? Because right now, that player maximum is what's holding all of that back and allowing all of this to be possible.
Right. So maybe that's the answer to this. If we think it's a problem, maybe I'd like to phrase the question. I'd like to phrase this instead of in the form of a statement, in the form of a problem. Because if there's one thing I hope I'm doing as I'm getting older is I'm getting a little bit smarter, and I recognize that just because I think something very strongly, maybe I have to recognize at this point that it doesn't make me right. So I feel like I'm sort of the last man standing on this side of the river saying This is not good. All these guys coming together. Chris Paul going to Houston is not a good thing. It's a bad thing, in my opinion, as a basketball fan, because you are further whittling down the pool of teams and players to choose from to watch that feel meaningful, that feel as though they matter. I believe what has made the NFL one of the unspoken, unsung factors of the enormous growth in popularity in the National Football League is that the weakest link is generally not that weak. You know, it's cyclical. There are always going to be bad teams, but they're not always the same ones. And there aren't only 3 or 4 teams that matter. Peyton Manning played almost his whole career in Indianapolis. Brett Favre played almost his whole career in Green Bay. Small markets, they made them matter. They were the glamour. And I think that matters. If all of a sudden all of these stars are going to just wind up in 5 teams and all the rest of the teams are just totally irrelevant, am I missing something, or is that a bad thing?
I don't see it as nearly a bad thing. Now, again, I come at it from a different place where this has been more in the prime of my sports career, so I've got that natural affinity to it. But I think it's a different version of what we've always had. This always comes up in pay for play in college when people say that the minute you start introducing that to the marketplace, you whittle that down to where only the big-time players are going to be able to influence recruits. And my point is always that ship has sailed. There always have been and will be haves and have-nots. It's just that we had such a clear vision of what that was this year and maybe last year too, that I think all of this talent coming together is a much better thing because you start to bring everyone down to there. And once you can knock Golden State off their perch, once a few more of these teams pop up, I think then you start to see it even back out a little bit.
All right, I'd like to hear from you on that and other things this morning. Where Mike and Mike were presented by Progressive Insurance. We're jam-packed this morning on the Shell Pennzoil Performance Line, including Teddy Atlas from Australia getting set for the fight and Jeff Van Gundy on all this basketball and a whole lot more. I also thought we could have a little fun this morning with Mike Golic Jr. in for Mike Golic Sr. today. I thought we could just do we'll sprinkle it in as the morning goes on, a little Grill Golic. Let's use the hashtag Grill Golic Jr., Grill Golic Jr., and just throw questions at him. We've done this for years with your dad, and let's do it this morning here. Now, usually with Mike, we would do it with football questions. Today, let's just stay away from sports. Anything you want to ask about growing up as a Golic, anything you want to ask about any of the number of other things, superheroes, which is obviously something that you're very intimately connected with, movies, you know an awful lot about, The Bachelorette, which I know is something you're following closely.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. Send them all. Nothing is off limits here. It's like a Reddit AMA happening live on air. It's terrifying.
The best of Mike and Mike.
Mike Golic Jr. is in for his dad today, and we're grilling Golic Jr. Grill Golic Jr. is the hashtag today. And someone tweeted in the joke, which retreats faster, the French army or your hairline. And one of the things that has sort of remained is that, like, bald jokes are almost the only ones left we can make. Like when your dad and I started this, like I could joke around about a lot of things with him, and almost all of them now we've become, as a society, sensitive to. And I get it, and I don't want to ever make anybody feel bad. We're just in the spirit of having fun here. But that feels like the one area of humor left that we can mine at this point. And so I'm grateful that you have a sense of humor about it.
The only option I have is to have a sense of humor about it, because if not, I'd be in the fetal position in the corner, because I am the easiest target in the world when it comes to this. I'm 27. I'm single in Central Connecticut, and I am male pattern balding like you know what. It is counterproductive to everything else I am trying to put in play. As much success as I could potentially have, as much as I could sweet talk somebody, I'm still battling against this. I bring hats around everywhere I go for that reason, and it still doesn't always help.
You do have a good head, though, if I may. Like, some people have a head that I think would not look good bald, and I think you have a head. Your head is nicely round, which I think is the key to looking good bald. I know the camera angle they keep showing is extremely unflattering.
No, yeah, I have a good round head. There's not a lot of lumps to it. There's not a bunch of different levels. There's no plateau up there. There's no great plane. It's just a good round head. And Bomani Jones has told me on multiple occasions, on air and through Twitter, to just go ahead and come on home.
Yeah.
And I'm real close at this point, mostly because it just doesn't keep coming back. Like, thankfully, if the facial hair ever stops coming in, I'm going to stop showing up to work because I'll have nothing left to offer anyone. And at that point, if I am still single, my mom is going to have to reconcile with some hard truths.
Keep the tweets
I'm so sorry, Mom.
coming. Hashtag Grill Golic Jr. We'll continue to have fun with this all morning long. All right, back to Houston, where they don't seem to have a problem. Now they've got James Harden and Chris Paul, and they're not done yet. We've talked at great length about their desire to add Paul George. And our Stephen A. Smith jumped into the mix yesterday suggesting there's another superstar who may soon be headed down to Houston.
Carmelo Anthony's going to have to make a decision. He's made an awful lot of money, over $300 million in his career. Does he care about the money or does he care about winning? Now, me knowing Carmelo Anthony the way that I do, I know he cares about both, but I also know that he cares about money more than he cares about anything else. So the first priority for him is making sure that $54 million owed to him, he's going to get that. That's number one. If he gets that but still gets bought out, I believe, based off of what I've heard in the last hour, that he'll end up following CP3 to Houston to join James Harden. That's my personal belief.
Okay, so let's be clear on what we're talking about here. When he's talking about the money, because bear in mind, if he allows himself to be traded, there's actually a trade kicker, so he actually gets more money, not less, and he goes and plays in Houston, which is Texas, which is no state taxes, versus New York, which is obscene state taxes. So he actually makes money on the deal. The reason Stephen A. is talking about him losing money is, would he accept a buyout at less than the full $54 million that remains in his contract? If the Knicks were going to buy him out, Phil Jackson would still be the president of the Knicks. The ultimate battle between Dolan and Jackson that wound up being the end of that relationship, from what everybody says, and it makes sense, is that Phil basically went to Dolan and said, look, we can't start building this thing until we find a way to move Carmelo. If he will not allow us to trade him, we need to buy him out. And James Dolan said, I can either buy you out for $24 million or I can buy him out for $54 million, and he made that choice. So if Carmelo is willing to allow himself to be traded to Houston, now that opens up that conversation. Mike Golic Jr., do you like the fit of Carmelo in Houston more, less, or equally to Paul George in Houston?
Less. He's older. He's a little more, ball dominant. Dependent on that, he gives you virtually nothing on the defensive end at this point, other than another fresh, warm body out there. So I still think Paul George is the overwhelmingly valued option in that scenario. But again, at this point, you're just jamming puzzle pieces together. So you take what you can get. You're going to get better with Carmelo there. He's still a viable offensive threat. For me, it gets interesting, too, because we keep hearing about the family portion of this with Carmelo, too,
right,
that he wants to stay close to his son. We've heard his wife say that. And that drives so many more decisions in the world of sports, whether it's players and coaches, than anyone can possibly account for, because we don't know those things. We don't deserve to know those things. And so if he can overcome that and finally get out of there, I still think that's interesting. But Paul George is the golden goose here.
Correct. I agree with everything you just said. And the reason I put it as Melo or Paul George is because you have to trade to get Paul George, and I don't believe the Knicks are going to buy out Carmelo Anthony, which would mean you'd have to trade to get him too. So I don't think that you get – if the Knicks wind up buying out Carmelo Anthony, then of course anything can happen. Everything goes on the table, and he might wind up in Cleveland. But I don't think that's going to happen. I don't think Carmelo is taking $1 less than the $54 million that he's owed. And guess what? He shouldn't. I wasn't there when they signed that contract, but I've never heard any reports that a gun was to anyone's head. So they signed it willingly. He deserves every cent of that money, and he should get it, and he will. But it remains, people talk about, well, Phil is gone, so Carmelo is happy now. The bottom line of it is you're still building something from nothing with the Knicks. You want to be young. They're still better off, Mike, trading Carmelo Anthony if they can, right?
Yes, as we've seen, if you're loitering around the basement in the NBA, it's better to just get all the way to the bottom floor before you can start going up again. And that's what they're up against here, because they were bad during this, but even yesterday it was getting rid of Phil Jackson doesn't solve your long-term problems. It's still going to be a bad basketball team for the most part. So I'm with you. That has to happen for them to move forward.
Yeah, and he's could sort of be whatever it is he brings back, it's something. There is no conceivable chance the Knicks are going to accomplish anything of great consequence in the NBA during the remainder of Carmelo Anthony's prime, which seems to be disappearing a little faster than some of his contemporaries because of injuries and the style of his game. So you trade him if he allows you to. Maybe his sort of mano-a-mano battle with Phil will make him a little more inclined to allow himself to be traded, because there won't be an ego clash involved. We'll find out. Here we are. We're back and better than ever. Mike and Mike, presented by Progressive Insurance. Our guests on the Shell Pennzoil Performance Line, they will include our very own Michael Eaves, who anchors SportsCenter and is very connected to the LA Clippers organization, and had a Facebook post yesterday with his insight into the relationships behind Chris Paul, Doc Rivers, and maybe the real reason, or at least one of them, why Chris Paul wanted out of L.A. Really interesting. If you didn't read it, you don't want to miss this. He'll be live with us in just a couple of minutes. But Mike Golic Jr. is in for his dad today, and we're having a little fun with a little Grill Golic Jr. The hashtag is Grill Golic JR. And there's a lot of fun stuff in here, and we'll just sprinkle them in all morning long. Here's one I've long wanted to ask you, like 2-3 years or however long it's been since this happened. Dan wants to know, how terrible was it for you when you had to take the photo when your dad posed for the butt picture?
That was tough. There's still a lot of therapy that Dad's paying for on that one on my behalf. Just because the more scarring moment was coming home that day, knowing I had to take the picture, and just seeing the baby oil on the counter, knowing what that meant, the baby oil and the roller on the counter, and knowing I was going to have to watch my mom oil my dad up, and something that, Dad hints at him every chance he gets on this show that's going on behind closed doors. I don't know how often I have to hear that porn track music.
During your childhood, so we started this show, you were 9, 10 years old?
9 years old.
2000? So, we've been making that joke. I would hit that little, for years and years, we knew it as page 10. I don't even know what page it is anymore. We're like 5 arrays later. But we would play that all the time.
Oh, yeah.
And it's one of those things I never really thought about while we were doing it, because our show was so insignificant when we started that I assumed that literally no one was listening. And I wasn't far from right, but you were. So when we would make those kind of jokes, and you and your brother Jake, who's only a year younger than you are, and your sister Sydney, who's a few years younger than that, you're probably in the car on your way to school listening to this.
Oh, I'll give you even better. In the training room at Notre Dame, getting ready for practice, they got the sound on in there, Mike and Mike sometimes in the morning, and all of a sudden, hey, Mike, parents are talking about having sex again on the radio. Oh, a word? Thanks, guys. Now the difference is I can fire back at them and give them some stuff that they don't want to know, and that hits a little closer to home. But, yeah, don't think that didn't go unnoticed. Dad, Mom. I shouldn't throw Mom into this. She is someone who's been dragged into this very unceremoniously, but my dad is a complete idiot.
Yes, she was an innocent victim in that every bit as much as you were. And then Chris, quickly, before we get Michael in here, Chris wants to know, how would you fare blocking your dad in his prime?
Run blocking would have been tough. Pass blocking, I mean, you just have to basically exist. We see the highlight all the time with Madden. You just stand there half the time. Stand there and let Reggie come.
On the line of scrimmage.
Stand there and just let Reggie and Clyde and Jerome and all those guys do the work.
You could have just been in the way. All right, keep those coming. Hashtag Grill Golic Jr. We'll sprinkle them in as the morning continues. We are presented by Progressive Insurance. Pick from a range of coverage options with the Name Your Price tool to find a price that works for you. Okay, as I mentioned, you know now that Chris Paul has, for lack of a better way of putting it, engineered himself a trade. You look at this and you say the transaction reads Chris Paul traded by the Clippers to the Rockets. But that's not really what happened here. What really happened here was Chris Paul worked his way out of L.A. and worked his way to Houston, specifically where he wanted to go. And as I mentioned, our colleague from SportsCenter, Michael Eaves, had fascinating insight into this on a Facebook post yesterday. It got a lot of attention, so we wanted to bring Michael in, as we do here on the Shell Pennzoil Performance Line. Michael, it's Mike and Mike Golic Jr. here. How are you this morning?
I'm doing well. What's happening?
Well, you tell us, because you're the one with all the news. Let's let you have the floor here and assume that the people listening to us did not read what you wrote on Facebook yesterday. Take it from the very top. What is your insight into what went on here behind the scenes between Doc Rivers and Chris Paul?
Well, as it pertains to Doc and Chris specifically, what happened was, Greeny, is just over the course of a couple of years, the relationship started to deteriorate, and quite honestly, from Chris Paul's standpoint, his trust and faith in Doc started to go downhill. It started really when Austin Rivers came on board, and that Chris Paul and some of the guys on the team didn't feel as if Austin really tried to be one of the guys, so to speak. They thought he felt a little entitled because his father was the head coach as well as the president of basketball operations, so he knew he was good. He could do no wrong in the face of the organization, and they felt as if Doc didn't address that enough. They also felt specifically timed games or practices that Austin was treated differently than some of the other guys on the team. Now, again, Doc would probably say, no, I'm equal with all the guys, or maybe I'm even harder on my son, but the players didn't feel that way, so they wouldn't see it that way. And then, of course, there was the proposed trade between the Knicks and the Clippers that involved Carmelo Anthony coming to L.A. along with Sasha Vujacic in exchange for Jamal Crawford, Paul Pierce, and Austin Rivers. I was told that the Knicks gave the Clippers about a 3-day window to respond and, come up with some type of deal if they didn't like what was on the table. Doc didn't respond within that timeline. No, deal's off the table. We're not going to negotiate. Now, maybe Doc was trying to play hardball with the Knicks because they knew they were in a tough position with Phil talking about Carmelo Anthony so much publicly. He tried to get something out of him. He called their bluff, and they pulled the deal. But in the eyes of Chris Paul and some of the players, they felt that Doc was more concerned with keeping Austin Rivers on the team than he was improving the team's chances in going to the Western Conference Finals. So that's how they felt, and that was just an example of all the things going on internally where Chris just didn't see Doc Rivers as a coach to get him to the conference finals, a place he's never been, or even as the head coach or president of basketball operations in both capacity. He lost faith in the organization as a whole. He wanted to go elsewhere.
And Michael, are there any specific instances of the things that you referenced with Doc and Austin Rivers, like specific examples of the ways that guys thought he was treated differently or wasn't holding up his end of the bargain?
Yeah, I mean, I can't point to one particular game where you can see evidence or in a practice, but what would happen was, let's say, I don't want to throw out a name, let's just say a guy on a team misses assignment on a pick and roll or didn't get back on defense or something, typical stuff that coaches get on players about. And they would get criticized. But the players felt as if oftentimes Austin Rivers would do something very similar but not get treated in a similar fashion by Doc. They felt that way. And again, when you see a guy that comes in and his dad's the coach, you automatically, whether you want to or not, we are human beings and we can't prevent our emotions from being what they are sometimes. You think that this guy's going to be treated differently, right? So you're looking for every opportunity when he is. Now, one thing you could go back and look at now, Mike, in terms of, hindsight being 20/20, there were a couple of games several times last year where Austin Rivers would go to the floor, where, he dove for a loose ball or got fouled or something. And there were times when players didn't go to pick him up. In today's NBA, if a guy goes to the floor, there's three guys running to go pick him up. It's like the new cool thing to do. It looks like you're all about a team. There were a couple of times where Austin Rivers got it by himself. And what I was told from a couple of people I spoke to, that was indicative of how the team felt about him during certain times last year.
Mike and Michael Leaves again with interesting insight into what's going on with the Clippers. And so Doc Rivers talked yesterday, and I don't know if he was directly addressing your comments in your Facebook post or not, but he, of course, was saying that none of that is the case and that his relationship with Chris Paul was fine and that Chris Paul just wanted to go play with Chris Harden. And so I just want to make sure what I'm understanding you to say here is that both of those could theoretically be true, that in Doc Rivers' mind, he may have thought everything was fine, and maybe he doesn't think he treats his son any differently, but that in Chris Paul's mind, that perception became reality. And whether the truth is somewhere in the middle or not, that's the way Chris Paul felt.
Exactly. And Greeny, oftentimes the truth is always in the middle.
Right.
But those are the feelings that Chris Paul and some of the other players had. It just led I'm not saying that's the reason he left specifically. What I'm saying is that relationship made Chris start to look at his organization differently and then maybe look at other places for him to go. Now, Doc is right. Chris Paul did want to go play with James Harden. And that's why, as you just said, it was Chris engineered this move for the Clippers to send him to Houston. Now, this was all part of a master plan by Chris Paul in terms of where he wanted to go play, which he played it brilliantly in terms of a player exercising the power that he has. So, yeah, all of that is true, Greeny, but the relationship between Chris Paul and Doc Rivers, and more specifically how Chris Paul viewed Doc Rivers, changed drastically over the last couple of years. And the irony, of course, is Chris Paul was all about Doc Rivers coming to L.A. to replace Vinny Del Negro after he left Boston. And remember, the Clippers gave up a first-round draft pick to get Doc Rivers. But you don't know what you have until you have it. And eventually Chris Paul realized that Doc Rivers wasn't the guy he wanted. I mean, there was a league exec who told me, quote, Chris Paul despises Doc Rivers. That's strong wording.
It's really strong, and you mentioned this was kind of the sentiment throughout the rest of the team. What do you see as the future going forward now that one of your best players, arguably your best player, just left for this reason? You've got a bunch of guys left that he's trying to make it work, and a coach that, when he was in Boston, didn't want to stick around and be part of a rebuild. How much longer do we think this marriage between Doc and the Clippers has left?
Well, that's a good question on a couple fronts. One, we don't know because we don't know who's going to be the leader of that ball club. I mean, Chris Paul wasn't just the best player on the team. He's the best player in the history of the franchise, and he's the best leader it's ever seen. What he did in terms of turning that franchise around, not only from a perennial playoff team, but to a relevant team across the NBA, cannot go overstated. He was everything for that organization, inside that locker room specifically. Now you have a core. The core of that group really is Blake Griffin, Jamal Crawford, and DeAndre Jordan, right? None of those three guys are what we would consider leaders of a championship-contending team. And that's not a knock on them. That's just not who they are. It's not who they've ever been called to be since they've been in the NBA. So for Doc Rivers' future, and as well as the team as a whole, who do you bring in to be that guy? Who do you bring in to head up this restructuring of your roster going forward in terms of what it's going to do on the court? That's a big question for them. And going back to Doc specifically, I'll say this. When he left Boston after winning a championship and taking the Celtics to another NBA Finals, he was in a different position. Like, he was probably too good, had too much stature to do a rebuild. But what is his stature right now? I mean, that championship was 9 years ago, right? When you think of Doc Rivers now, you think of a guy who couldn't get Chris Paul, Blake Griffin, DeAndre Jordan to the conference finals in the West, even though they were up 3-1 against the Rockets with home games that should have closed it out. So he's in a different position now than he was when he was leaving Boston before he came to L.A.
It's a good point. That was the original 3-1. Mike and Mike were presented by Progressive Insurance. Michael Eaves from SportsCenter with great insight into the situation with the Clippers. And I find all this really curious because they just brought Jerry West there. You bring Jerry West in and you think, all right, he's the guy who's going to go out and recruit LeBron. LeBron and Chris Paul are such good friends. All of that kind of adds up together, and now Chris Paul leaves. So what role does Jerry West play in all of this and shaping whatever the future of the Clippers turns out to be?
Greeny, you could also make the argument that them doing that, bringing in Jerry West to go pursue LeBron James, is indicative of how much Doc Rivers didn't realize how his relationship with Chris Paul had changed, right? Because Chris Paul's family loves Los Angeles. His brother, who serves as his manager, has a couple of kids. They bought a house there. Chris has a house there. His parents have a house there as well. They go back and forth between North Carolina and L.A. He did not want to leave. So what would happen? What would have to happen in order for Chris to engineer a move to Houston? If I'm the organization, if I'm Steve Ballmer specifically, how did this happen? We can't allow it again. Now, to get to your question specifically, I think the one thing that Jerry West can do with Doc Rivers and Lawrence Frank is he can teach them or help them manage assets. No one was better at that in terms of an NBA exec than Jerry West, going back to his days with the Lakers and also what he did with the Memphis Grizzlies specifically. They have a lot of assets now because they got 7 players in a trade, they got a little bit of money, and they got a 2018 first-round draft pick. All right, how do you take that and make a move to get the guy that we were just talking about? Who's going to be the leader of this team? Who's going to be the superstar that you can count on in the last 3 minutes of a game to give you a W and keep going up the ranks for a playoff contender? That's the question, and that's what Jerry West has to do for this team. Doc Rivers has not shown a history of being able to do that since he's been the president of basketball operations. Jerry West has done it his entire lifetime.
Yeah, I the timing of all of that, to me, is the most interesting piece in all of it. And so let me ask you one last thing, because you know that some of the guys involved, at least in the case of Chris Paul, pretty well. There's a school of thought, I sort of subscribe to it, my partner Mike Golic Sr. does not at all, that the 4 best friends, the 4 amigos, which is LeBron and Carmelo and Chris Paul and Dwayne Wade, have it in their heads that at some point before it's all said and done, they want to play together. I would have thought that L.A. would have been a really logical place for that to happen, and so Chris Paul's departure puts a little bit of a monkey wrench in that. But now we're hearing about maybe Melo going down there. How would you assess the likelihood that those guys are able to engineer a way of at some point all winding up on the same team?
Honestly, Greeny, I don't think it affected negatively at all. In fact, I think it increases his chances, and I'll tell you why. Because Chris Paul will be in the exact same position next summer that he was this summer. An opportunity to sign a max deal, 5 years, $200+ million with Houston, or a 4-year deal worth a little bit more than $150 with someone else. He will still have that opportunity next year. But what now he has in front of him, along with LeBron James, they can pretty much go wherever they want. If he had signed the max deal with the Clippers, the only place LeBron could have joined him was the Clippers. Let's say he signed a 5-year deal with the Clippers and they did a sign and trade with Houston. The only place LeBron could have joined him is Houston. If it doesn't work out with James Harden and Chris Paul on the court, which is a valid question, and Chris Paul will have one season to know if he can do it with James Harden or not, then he and LeBron can team up and go wherever they want. And a place they can go, Greeny, is back to Los Angeles. They could go to the Lakers next summer. Mm-hmm. The 2 of them could go because the Lakers will have enough cap money. And let's say, for sake of argument, Steve Ballmer gets rid of Doc Rivers as head coach and president of basketball operations. You got Jerry West there. I think Chris Paul and LeBron James wouldn't have a problem going back to Jerry West, provided they hire the right coach. So anything is still possible despite Chris Paul getting this trade. It's just a 1-year deal. It's just a 1-year deal.
It's a really good point. And all 4 of those guys will likely be free agents on July 1st of next year. Chris Paul opted in, so as you just described, he'll have that opportunity. Carmelo has a player option to become a free agent. Dwayne Wade has 1 year left on his current deal, and LeBron James has a player option to become a free agent. I continue to say I think that's a real possibility. And, Michael, this was terrific. Excellent insight, and we really appreciate the time this morning. Thanks so much. We'll see you soon.
Hey, no problem, guys. Take care.
You too. That's Michael Eaves with us from SportsCenter with really good insight into a little bit of the background and the history and the relationships internally with that. So there's a lot there to unpack. Let's try and do it. Let's start with those relationships. I don't know how, again, you were a player, I'm not. That notion that I can see where Doc Rivers might get up there and say, no, I didn't treat my son any differently. I didn't view him any differently. And he may mean that. He may genuinely believe that. And Chris Paul might have They might have both seen an incident, whatever it might have been, with completely different eyes. Doc Rivers saw it one way, Chris Paul saw it another way. Neither one is necessarily right or wrong, but perception becomes reality. Does that make sense to you?
Well, especially perception within the realm of nepotism, which is something that I have a little bit of experience with myself, sitting in this chair right now. I mean, we've been doing the Grill Golic all morning, and I just got one that's obviously meant as a slight, but has Golic Jr. done or achieved anything on his own, or has it all come by riding his dad's coattails? And that's the perception that you have to overcome. And if you're Austin Rivers, you have to go in there and almost redouble those efforts to show that that's not the same. I mean, walking in the building here, I had people I know I've talked to who I've worked with who came in and had that viewpoint of me. And then you have to go in and you're constantly battling against that. And so if Austin Rivers, it sounds like to Michael Eaves' point, didn't go out of his way and maybe even went the other way a little bit in this, then that's obviously just going to feed into a mentality that was probably already there to begin with. The minute they made that signing, everyone probably rolled their eyes in that locker room and said, all right, here we go with this.
Yeah, it's an interesting point. I'll give you another quick analogy to it. When Brian Schottenheimer was the offensive coordinator of the Jets, I spent an evening with him one time just through like a charitable thing, and I was chatting with him, and he kept referring to his father as Marty. And at one point I said to him, it's interesting that you call your father Marty as opposed to Dad. And he said, when he first put me on his staff, I decided that when I'm going to be in that room, he was a low-level assistant, but he was an assistant coach, and he wanted to be viewed as a coach. And he said, if I were in meetings, and I was like, Dad, I suggest we do this, they're going to view me in a different way. And so I just started calling him Marty, and it kind of stuck. So I understand where that kind of stuff works. So I don't know but Doc Rivers getting up there yesterday and saying, no, that's not the way things were, he's not necessarily lying. He may have viewed it one way, and Paul may have seen it another way. Now let's move to the really interesting piece. I am of the opinion that the guys who will be known as the banana boat friends because of the famous picture, but Chris Paul and the four guys who got up at the start of last year's ESPYs and all of that, they're genuinely good friends. They genuinely have big picture interests that go well beyond basketball. I really believe that we will see the four of them unite like the Avengers.
Yes.
At some point, and next year could be that year. Do you think it'll happen?
I think it'll happen. We see all the stars aligning in a way that makes it really enticing. I just don't think that translates into anything meaningful. Like with those guys at the stage they are in all of their careers at this point, you put them all together, and I'm not sure that's a championship contending team the way it's presently constructed. So that's the one issue, is especially if you're LeBron James, because he is the most outside of maybe Chris Paul to gain or lose in all this in the legacy conversation. Does he want to seriously push for another championship, or does he want to play with his friends?
I don't know. That's the same argument that your father made, and I should have mentioned that Michael Eaves was on the Shell Pennzoil Performance line, taking synthetic motor oil performance to a whole new level. Make the switch to Pennzoil Synthetics today. I don't think they view it that way, and especially when you look at Dwayne Wade will be in a situation where he can play, if he wants to, for comparatively little money. Carmelo could be in a position, if he wants to play for comparatively little money. They could take deals where they don't have to be the only four guys on the team. I mean, Dwayne Wade, if he's the fifth best player on your team, is still a ridiculously good player. If LeBron's your best player and Chris Paul's your second best player, and then Dwayne Wade and Carmelo Anthony are just pieces of the puzzle, and there are other pieces, I'm just making this up, but whatever Lonzo Ball turns out to be, or Brandon Ingram turns out to be, or you take those two guys and you turn them into someone else that fits nicely with the four amigos, I think they're going to do it. I really believe you're going to see it happen.
I think you would need that kind of shot of youth and athleticism, especially on the wings, because, again, that's the currency of the new NBA. That's where we've seen Golden State really exploit advantages, and that's what LeBron is desperately needed to help him along the way.
the best of Mike and Mike.
We have a few minutes here with Jeff Van Gundy, and I don't want to waste a second as we dive into all of this NBA offseason action. Jeff, it's Mike and Mike Golic Jr. this morning. How are you?
Doing well.
Good. So are the Rockets at this point as they manufacture the deal, and clearly this is what Chris Paul wanted, and this is what Mike D'Antoni gets. And you make your home in Houston, so you obviously see them more often than you see, I guess pretty much anybody. So put James Harden and Chris Paul in the backcourt together for me. How does it work?
It's a good question. I think there is going to be a period of adjustment for both. I think Mike D'Antoni's got to convince Chris Paul to shoot the three more off the catch when he's playing in a spot-up position as Harden has the ball, and to get the ball up a little bit quicker when he's the one who has the ball. And I think Harden's going to have to get used to some reduced time with the ball. And I think it's going to be an adjustment for both players. I think it'll be interesting. I'm not sure it'll necessarily translate into more regular season wins as far as I don't think you're going to see him jump from 55 to 65, but I think they'll make a good improvement in the regular season. But what I think it poises them to do is be better in the playoffs, particularly when Harden's out of the game and when Harden is in a struggle like he was last year when they ended their season at home against San Antonio. So I think it really helps them have a better chance in the playoffs to match up against the great teams in the West.
Jeff, so far this offseason, Paul George has led the league in Photoshop jerseys on the internet. And I'm just wondering, now we hear him linked to this new iteration of the Rockets. We've heard him talked about in Cleveland and Boston. Which team in your mind would get the biggest lift and maybe have the best potential to challenge Golden State by adding Paul George?
The Detroit Pistons. That's who I want to see him go to. No, I think Boston, obviously, they're going to be players because I think teams see them or players see them as a group that if they can stay together could be a great, great team on par with anybody else in the East. And so I think I don't know who Boston would rather have, if it would be Gordon Hayward or Paul George. Probably Hayward, I'd say, because all they have to give up for him is cap room. But I think Paul George is still, as good as he is, he's underrated. I don't think people understand just what a weapon he is at both ends of the floor. To be able to match up and go head-to-head against the best small forwards in the league, LeBron James, Kevin Durant, those types, I think Boston would be hugely benefited by his two-way brilliance.
Mike and Mike, Jeff Van Gundy is with us. And for anyone who didn't get the reference he made at the beginning there, Jeff's brother Stan is the man in charge of the Pistons. I'm just curious, Jeff, you've been at this a really long time. We are now in a place where the big stars in this sport, not only do they move around as frequently as they do, but they are smart enough to have figured out that they can keep all kinds of pressure and leverage on the franchises, even the ones they're playing for, by maintaining all of these options. Chris Paul's in Houston, but he doesn't have to stay more than 1 year. LeBron James has an out after next season. Dwayne Wade could be free next year. Carmelo Anthony, if he chooses to, could be free next year. So we're sitting here speculating about the four of those guys playing together. But from the standpoint of an organization and a coach, how does it change everything when these guys not only have the power they wield because they're stars, but also maintain that leverage because they could walk away from you almost any time they want?
Well, I think for the organizations that care deeply about winning, it's not a bad thing because these guys want to win, and they want you to try to get as great a players as you can to put together. I think for ownership, you see in some of these teams are going to pay massive tax bills down the line, what Golden State's paying, what Cleveland has paid in the past. And so from an ownership standpoint, if you're in the business for profits and profit margin and you don't want to pay the tax, it's going to be hard because you're probably not going to win at the championship level now if you're not willing to pay the tax on occasion or in some cases all the time. And so, yeah, they do have leverage. They're wielding it. I don't know if this type of grouping team guys, great superstars together is good for the league or bad for the league, but it doesn't really matter because it is what the league is going to be for the foreseeable future.
Jeff, when you look at some of the teams just on the cusp of maybe joining at least the competitive groups, the young groups like the 76ers and the Timberwolves, is there one in particular that you would bet on for maybe the next, let's say, 5 to 10 years that you think could grow into something resembling a competitive team in this league that could maybe get to that upper echelon?
I love Minnesota. I think they went from nurturing these younger players to making a bold move for Jimmy Butler, and now they still have improvements to make along the way. The biggest improvement Minnesota has to make is they have to get Karl Anthony Towns and Andrew Wiggins from being young, talented offensive players to young, determined two-way players. Defensively, they have a long way to go, and their offensive skill and talent is not questioned, but they've got to bring to the game the mentality that Butler does to play at both ends, because Butler came into the league a lot different than those two number one picks. He came in as the last pick in the first round, had to fight for minutes in his rookie year on a good team, and had to do it to get on the floor to improve offensively. He had to first get out there and defend and rebound and play a supporting role. So I think Towns and Wiggins would do themselves and their team a lot of good is if they tried to take on that same bulldog mentality at the defensive end that Jimmy Butler has. And if they do, they're going to be very, very formidable.
Mike and Mike, Jeff Van Gundy on the opposite end of the spectrum, the New York Knicks, who have been struggling candidly since the day you left. And now Phil Jackson is gone. What is your reaction to what happened there with Phil?
Yeah, it's too bad because this is a guy who's had a very storied career for so very, very long in the NBA, both as first as a role player on championship teams in New York to the great successes he had in both Chicago and L.A. With those dominant teams. So it's too bad, and I never like to see anybody lose their job. I think he's at peace with it. I think he did the best thing he could do, and I think New Yorkers are going to remember him for a long time because of the drafting of Porzingis. I think also Hernan Gomez was a good pickup. So I think the record is what the record is, but I think they have to also remember that Phil Jackson did some very good things there. And I think going forward, I think what it allows them to do, Mike, is Jeff Hornacek can now sort of play however he wants to play. I think the shackles are off. I don't think he has to conform to any preconceived notion of the best way to play with the talent at hand. He can determine that, and I think that's going to allow him to be the best coach he can be. And, hopefully they find some continuity, some chemistry together, whichever direction Mr. Dolan decides to go, so that they can get back to being a competitive team.
Okay, keep your eyes closed.
Okay.
I want to show you my first ever painting.
All right.
Okay. Open your eyes.
Oh, that's a lot of colors and shapes.
So be honest. What do you think?
Well, I like how if you switch to GEICO, you could save hundreds of dollars on car insurance.
Oh, yeah, that's true.
Yeah. Here, why don't I hold your paintbrush while you call them?
GEICO, because saving 15% or more on car insurance is always a great answer.
Here we are, and that's the morning we got working. We're Mike and Mike Golic Jr. in with us today. We're presented by Progressive Insurance. Our guests on the Shell Pennzoil Performance Line, and I want to make a very quick reminder, you can meet Peyton Manning at the ESPYs. A couple of weeks. Today is your final day to donate to the V Foundation for your chance to win that. Go to ebay.com/ESPN. You could be hanging out in L.A. with the great Peyton Manning at the ESPYs in July. It is our pleasure to welcome Will Cain into the conversation. He's always good for the chaos. I mean, Mike Golic Jr. has made it his goal today to provide just chaotic energy in the program. And, Will, that's sort of your middle name.
That's my game. I'm here. Let's do it. Let me start yelling at you. Go.
Every time I see you, and it's not with the willpower, smoke, and signage that you get on First Take, I feel like I've been cheated personally.
Me too. Yeah. I mean, I was wondering where my smoke was just now.
I figured that was written into the deal.
Me too. I was going to do a LeVar Ball walk, go through the smoke, have you guess, is Will having a seizure or is he doing a LeVar Ball walk? And you wouldn't. I'm not sure you'd be able to tell the difference.
I can speak to someone who saw this. Of you actually coming into the room, like, this isn't a joke. Art imitates life, and Will Cain actually, LeVar Ball, sauntered into the room here, and I was able to mildly pick it out. But you're right. It was between that and calling 911. It was between a laugh and fearing for your life.
All right, Cain is here. Let's start with the big sports news of the day, and then we'll work ourselves to other things. When you first heard Chris Paul had engineered his way, and again, let's make this very clear, the transaction says trade, but this was not a trade. This was Chris Paul dictating where he wanted to go every bit as much as he would have had he been a free agent. So he goes to Houston to team with James Harden. When you first heard that, what was the first thought that went from your mind from a basketball standpoint?
Well, whoa. Can I just leave out from the basketball standpoint for one moment? Because yesterday I was sitting on First Take, and I'm having some kind of, as you said, chaotic yelling match with either Max Kellerman or John Sally or Stephen A. Smith, someone I like to yell with.
Right.
And Cassidy Hubbarth writes something on a piece of paper and passes it over to me. And, I mean, the message is essentially stop talking, be quiet, right? But what the words actually said were Chris Paul traded. So what was the first thought that went through my mind at that moment? Why? Why would Chris Paul ever allow himself to be traded? What's in it for him? I get what would be in it for the Rockets. I get what would be in it for the Clippers. But for Chris, I was like 4 or 5 days, and he's a free agent. And 4 or 5 days, he can pick wherever he wants to go. Why does this make sense for Chris? That's real time on TV as somebody's passing you the note. It took not long after that to realize, as you guys have been talking about, Chris is an utter maestro. I mean, he just pulled every puppet string on this entire deal to get all the money he would have gotten if he stayed with the Clippers, give himself more optionality on whatever team he wants to play with from a year from now, and have a year of experiment with James Harden. It's just an amazing masterpiece of off-season maneuvering by Chris Paul.
Agreed. And again, he's the president of the Players Association, so if anyone knows how to do it, he knows how to do it. Before we get to next year, what do you expect from them this year? Chris Paul, James Harden together, great or a disaster?
Oh, do I have to pick between those two?
Well,
only those two options.
If it's only okay, then that's not interesting. Will they? Here's the way I phrased the question to Golic Jr. earlier this morning. Two things can come together and either increase in the way of addition, it's 1 + 1, or they can increase in the way of multiplication. It's 100 times 100. Is this 100 plus 100, or is it 100 times 100?
God, I like that so much better than great versus awful. Because I heard you this morning, Greeny, and I agree 100%. The way I would put it is this. I fear that Chris Paul plus James Harden is that the sum is less than the components of the parts. Those two guys together add up to less than they do when they are apart. James Harden was unlocked last year, 7 assists to 11 assists. That unlocked the Houston Rockets from 41 wins to 55 wins. And that happened with him being the primary ball handler and distributor. Now, I can't imagine a scenario where that's not Chris Paul. I mean, I just assume that goes to Chris Paul's hands. And so you're changing James Harden's role. You always trade for talent in the NBA. We know you have to do this deal. Daryl Morey has to do this deal. But I am worried that it doesn't add up to the fantasy basketball team we all want it to be.
You agree or disagree, Golic Jr.?
I agree. That was sort of why I likened it to just jamming puzzle pieces together this morning, the drunk toddler that we've made not drunk retroactively. But it's trying to take the best things available and make them work together. But this is like giving the Frankenstein monster of NBA teams that you're trying to build two heads. It might look great. They're two great heads, but they don't really help you as much on the basketball court because it's not complementary skill sets. James Harden can be a shooting guard. We've seen it before, but to Will's point, we know he's so much better. He's the runner-up for the MVP this year, and you're really going to make that guy switch positions.
One more thing. Look, and I mean, we've all been reading and listening to Michael Eaves over the last, whatever it's been, 18 hours since his post went up on Facebook, and talking about the really, really bad personality conflicts that existed within the Los Angeles Clippers. And many of those had to do with Chris Paul. I'm not going to talk about blame. I'm not going to talk about, if it's Chris's fault or Doc's fault or Austin's fault or Blake's fault. All I know is there are some very difficult personalities in that mix. And Chris demands the absolute best of everyone around him. Is James's defense going to live up to that standard? Is James Harden next to Chris Paul going to be a mesh for, I don't know, we all get along come January and February? Really? I mean, that's not the history of Chris Paul. I just think you have some potential cracks in the foundation there that have to do with function and personality and getting along.
So let's find out what they do next. If they find a way to get themselves Paul George, which is what everyone says they're pointing at, and there's even an outside chance they wind up with Carmelo Anthony, although I think that's next to impossible because I don't think Carmelo Anthony gets bought out. I think if Carmelo Anthony was going to get bought out by the Knicks, Phil Jackson would still be there. So I think that Carmelo Anthony is, if he's going to move, he's going to be by a trade. And I don't think the Rockets are going to trade anything for Carmelo.
If they buy out Carmelo, Greeny, I'm going to LeVar Ball walk through every set at ESPN because I've been a little defensive of Phil over the last it's actually been over the last year. The first time I was ever on TV with Stephen A. Smith, the issue we went at it over was Phil Jackson. And I feel like it's become a very easy and I'm not saying this about Stephen A. or anyone. Of course, Stephen A. is very prepared. But you don't have to show up with any notes to come on TV and be the loudest guy right now saying, Phil has to go. It's the easiest take on TV or radio. And the race is to see who can say it the most passionately. And in that process, I heard you had Jeff Van Gundy on. A lot got washed under the bridge. A, that Phil did that was okay. B, that he certainly didn't live up to this he's horrendous, worst GM in the history of sports moniker. And if the real nail in the coffin was he wanted to buy out Carmelo, and we don't want that, and then they do buy out Carmelo? I mean, what are we doing here?
But I have to stop there for a second because yes, if they buy out Carmelo, some will view it as a vindication of Phil, but it actually isn't. Phil is the one who gave him the contract and gave him the no-trade clause in the first place, and so he's trying to retroactively clean up a mess that he was not obligated to make in the first place. If the owner actually mandated that to him, Phil Jackson is a person of the stature who could say to James Dolan, if you're telling me how to do my job, then I'm not staying here. And he stayed for the money. Phil Jackson went there for the money. Phil Jackson did not put the time and the energy and the effort into this job that is required of it, that every other person in that position does. That's a fact. It's not my opinion. That is an actual fact. It's been documented in a million different places. And there is also no question that he tried to coach that team from the 8th row of the stands by forcing a triangle down the throat of no one who was interested in it at all, whether you want to say the triangle could have some functionality in the current NBA or not, which I don't know what the answer to that is. If you have the right players doing almost anything, it probably would work. But if he's trying to force a system on people that don't have any interest in running it, to me, that's not going to work. And then the public criticism of Carmelo Anthony, and then now trying to send an international public spanking to Kristaps Porzingis, which I think was actually defeating to his own purpose also. I think Phil Jackson screwed this thing up every way you can screw something up.
I mean, you can visually see his passion.
Yeah, no, it's jumping off the page.
Well,
It backed me down. It backed me down.
Part of it is because it does bother me to have to say it, because I love Phil Jackson. I love the guy since I was 5 years old. He's one of my favorite players. He wore number 18 on the Knicks when I was a little kid, and I loved him. Well, and then I've been around him enough to know that he's a smart guy who knows better than what happened here. He's much too smart to have let this happen if his heart was really in it. And I believe his heart wasn't in it. He just took the money. And that's really about as bad a thing as you can do in almost any circumstance.
I said that there were two versions of the way you can look at Phil's tenure, and I think Will actually agrees with neither of them, which is that either the apathy was such that he really didn't care, it was just a cash grab, and he was mailing it in, which I think if you're Phil Jackson is the narrative I would rather have people buy into than just the fact that you had a guy from a bygone era who didn't translate well into this role.
I don't buy any of that. That's right.
Who was just incompetent in his role at team president and wasn't able to operate by the own standard that he had set, because for better or for worse, Phil Jackson was going to be judged off Phil Jackson, the coach, and not any normal standard of what a president of an organization does, even one that's as crippled just by ownership as the Knicks are with James Dolan.
That's the real issue here, Junior. I mean, somehow I have become the hot take artist on this, looking for the controversial, attention-seeking position to say, no. There wasn't a conspiracy to sabotage the Knicks. Number two, he didn't mail it in just to take his $60 million. Number three, I won't be boxed into a position of suggesting Phil Jackson was GM of the year. And I'm saying that, yeah, he made some bad moves. At the top of the list was giving Carmelo that contract, followed by giving Noah his contract. His handling of Carmelo and Porzingis behind the scenes, it worked for Phil for a long time to play the game like this. It worked for Phil to manage personalities like this for a long time. Was it the right way to do it this time? No, probably not, because he wasn't around those guys on a daily basis to establish a relationship the way he was with the Bulls and Lakers. So when you go to the press and you trash talk them or you talk about their flaws, you can cover up for it on a daily basis when you're the coach. When you're the GM, when you're the president, you can't because you're not around them. But, Greeny, I guess it's just, I think it's rewriting the entire last 4 years. The record's not good. Jeff Van Gundy said that. I agree. The record's not good. But you will have Porzingis. You will have Hernan Gomez. You will have Ntilikina. We'll see who he turns out to be going forward. And my fear for Phil is that what will happen will be you have some kind of nucleus to build upon that will be something he put into place and will be forgotten. Just like Sam Hinkie built the Sixers and now he gets no credit for it. That's what will happen. I'm not sitting here telling you he's great, but he's certainly not the trash everyone wants to pretend like he is today.
I think the only difference there, and the reason I'm more comfortable giving Sam Hinkie that retroactive credit, is because Sam Hinkie went in there with a very clearly defined plan, and I think that's something that in Phil's role he always lacked, and that's the one thing you need. And you mentioned there were good things that happened, but when you pull in the other direction simultaneously with the other moves that you make, you brought in a couple of good young guys that would in theory think, okay, you could maybe have that nucleus to build around going forward now, but you supplemented that by bringing in other things to buoy what was at that point a sinking ship. And I think when you undercut yourself like that, you remove for me the idea that you were somehow the intentional architect of what would be success going forward.
Absolutely. By the way, Sam Hinkie did a much more masterful job than Phil Jackson ever did. Look, I want to be self-aware with you, and especially with your passion. And I have to ask myself, Will, why are you taking this position? Because the potential upside is actually very low. Like, what am I arguing for? He wasn't that bad. Like, what do I win if I win that debate? And I know that when I see everyone agree on something, my antennas go up instinctually to go, something's wrong. Because unanimous agreement says to me that there's a flaw here. And I know that that's guiding me to some extent on this. But I can't let that, because that's just being reactionary for reactionary's sake. But I know this, that the glee and the celebration over Phil Jackson's firing at the very least is utterly and totally misplaced. The one constant in the New York Knicks problems is James Dolan. It has been for, what are we looking at, 17 years?
It's about right.
1999, and they have the fourth worst record in the NBA over that time. They've gone through 8 executives and 11 coaches. He is the one constant, and when the one constant is at the top of your organization, it isn't hard to pin the blame.
I don't disagree with that at all, but I don't think both can't be true. James Dolan, from the time he has taken over the Knicks, and he took over a team that had been in the NBA Finals the year before, they have the fewest playoff wins and the most coaches. That's a recipe for it's an express train to stinking. I totally get it, and he is absolutely the problem. That doesn't mean that Phil Jackson didn't do a terrible job. And to the final thing that you said, I would say there's a much better chance that Hernan Gomez winds up being a rotation player in the NBA than that he becomes a star. And I'd say there's a much better chance that players drafted after this French kid the Knicks just took, whose name no one can pronounce, like Malik Monk and Zach Collins.
Don't forget Dennis Smith, please, because I'm a Maverick
fan. Dennis Smith, who, I mean, when last seen, has like the greatest highlight dunk that you've ever seen in your entire life. There is a much better chance that at least one of those players winds up being a better NBA player than this guy than there is that this guy's going to wind up being a star. And when you hear that they drafted him because of his fit into the triangle, that's the kind of thing that really upsets a lot of people, because it just doesn't make any sense.
I just feel like, again, what we've done is we've already decided Phil's incompetent and or sabotaging, and then you back engineer that onto Ntilikina. As a Mavericks fan who was drafting 9th, right behind the Knicks at 8, I know that the Mavs had very serious interest in Ntilikina, and the Mavs don't run the triangle. I know that kid has potential that many, many teams were interested in, and it's not just because he somehow was running the triangle in France.
Listen, stand by. Hold on. I just got this. I'm going to use this as like breaking news. Mike and Mike, Will Cain is here with the Straight Talk, brought to you by Straight Talk Wireless, best phones, best networks, no contract. Stephen A. just tweeted at us. Hold on. He just tweeted, update Greeny. Found out last night, Melo would accept buyout to go to Cavs. To Houston Rockets would have to be by trade. So that's Stephen A. Smith tweeting, there's 9:12. It's 3 minutes ago. Greeny, found out last night Melo would accept a buyout to go to the Cavs, too. To the Rockets would possibly be via trade. So here's the bottom line of it. What does a buyout mean? And Stephen A., just someone call him, because I need to ask him this question. By buyout, does that mean give me my whole $54 million and I'll go? That's one thing. Is there some lesser amount of money he would take for the opportunity to go to Cleveland and play with LeBron, which I think is a great fit. I know a lot of people don't think it's a great fit. Will Cain, I think Carmelo to Cleveland is an excellent fit.
Yeah, if you're lining up the potential fits for Carmelo, I think the Cavs have to be number one. Just running through it in my head, we've heard rumors of the Sixers, which makes absolutely zero sense to me. I would not, if I were running the Sixers, want Carmelo on that team. We've heard rumor of the Wizards. Yeah, well, I mean, Wall, Beal. What number is Carmelo if he's in the Wizards? The number 2 option? 3 option?
Offensively?
Yeah.
Well, on any team he goes to, he's the number 1 scoring option. That's the reality. But that is. He's the number 1 scoring option.
In his own mind or in actuality?
That's what I mean. You can't. Carmelo Anthony isn't going anywhere, and when you throw him the ball, his first instinct is not going to be to try and score it. That's his game. That's his mentality. That's all he does.
Well, then that's all the more reason why this won't work, because if you were telling me he'd accept a buyout to go to Cleveland and he sees himself as anything but the third banana on that team, you're going to be the thing that sinks the ship.
Well, you can be any number of banana you want in the overall total picture of things, but when it comes purely to scoring,
you're on the banana boat.
He's the best pure scorer of that group. I mean,
I disagree.
The people who's a better
Kyrie
pure
Irving?
scorer?
Kyrie Irving might be the best pure scorer in the NBA. He is definitely at this point in time better than Carmelo.
Stephen A. Carmelo can score as many different ways. Let's find out. Here's Stephen A. Steve, I know you're on vacation, but you're sitting there with the Twitter, so we thought that we would jump in here. We got Will Cain, we got Mike Golic Jr. Thanks for calling in, Steve. How you doing?
What's going on, fellas? How y'all doing?
Well, I needed to, because we just read your tweet on the air, and I need to ask you a follow-up question to it, and there'll probably be others,
sure.
Which is, when you say Carmelo would accept a buyout to go to Cleveland, are you talking about accepting less than the whole $54 million that he is owed? You're saying he would take some of that money. Yeah, go ahead.
Correct. I'm not saying it's a lot less, but I've learned that he's made it very, very clear that the one team that he would accept the buyout for is Cleveland. Definitely so. And I've also heard that the Knicks are aware that he wants out, that now is the time that he needs to be gone. So they're definitely entertaining something. Obviously, Phil Jackson and James Dolan were on a different page in terms of what it would require in order for him to be gone, because Dolan loves the guy and wants him to stay. But he has reached a point where he believes it's time that he needs to go. It just has to be the right situation. But I learned from some league sources that he's made it very, very clear that when we talk buyout, think Cleveland Cavaliers, because obviously with a buyout you're talking about taking less, and that's the one team he would take less for. That may not necessarily be the case with Houston. In order for Houston to get something done, it would probably require a trade. But he would definitely accept the buyout to go to Cleveland. But this is Carmelo Anthony we're talking about here. He might take less, but it ain't going to be a lot less.
Stephen A., not to rehash our debate from yesterday, but I'm just trying to reconcile the news, and you are certainly someone who's always at the forefront of news in the NBA, and especially with Carmelo. Help me understand, then, if we are to believe that a potential Carmelo buyout was the relationship ender for James Dolan and Phil Jackson. And, of course, there's a lot of history there. We don't have to go through everything that potentially ruined that relationship. But that was reportedly, as of yesterday, the nail in the coffin for Phil. How are we sitting here today where the Knicks are still in a position to consider a buyout? If Carmelo wanted it and Phil wanted it, why did that end the relationship?
Well, you got to remember that to me, I wasn't the one that said that was the nail in the coffin, because if you recall, it was Porzingis obviously making his feelings known, refusing to show up for the exit interview, not returning Phil Jackson's phone call, Phil Jackson ultimately bringing heat upon himself and the organization by taking phone calls in regards to Porzingis potentially being traded. All of those things played a role. It certainly wasn't just Carmelo, because if it were Carmelo, then Phil would have been gone months ago, or Carmelo would have been traded months ago, because that's how bad that relationship had gotten throughout the season, as we all know. But in terms of what's going on now, them being on the same page and, considering the buyout, you got to remember, Phil wanted the buyout. Melo didn't mind being bought out. That doesn't mean it's something that James Dolan wanted to do. So there's going to take some convincing towards James Dolan in order for this to get done, because if James Dolan says no, then it can't happen, because Carmelo Anthony is still locked in. But James Dolan and Carmelo Anthony have a good enough relationship where they communicate directly, where if Carmelo makes it very, very clear that that's something he wants, it will at least be strongly considered by James Dolan. And I'm told that's exactly what Carmelo Anthony has done. He's let them know that this is something that he believes it's time to get done, for him to be going for the New York Knicks.
And so let's read the tea leaves here, because, Stephen A., the whole thing is starting to come together. And you were one of the first people, if not the first, to be ahead of the big three coming together in Miami. So you could just sort of see the way this is playing. Carmelo gets himself bought out, and that means that at this time next year, he can go wherever he wants. LeBron can go wherever he wants. Wade can go wherever he wants, and Chris Paul worked this thing out so he can go wherever he wants. Those four guys are going to be somewhere together in 2018, aren't they?
I'm not sure about that. I'm really not. I think that I can foresee, see D Wade and LeBron ending up together and Melo and CP3 ending up together in Houston. That's something that I reported yesterday in terms of, their interest. Carmelo Anthony is definitely interested in going to Houston if he cannot end up in Cleveland. It doesn't necessarily mean that Cleveland is his first choice. He's going to think about his business first. He's going to think about his money, and he's going to think about what's the most viable opportunity available to him. But those are the two teams on his radar at this particular moment in time that I'm told he views as plausible, either Cleveland or Houston. It remains to be seen what will happen. But, you sort of saw the tea leaves when you learned that Chris Paul had told the Los Angeles Clippers, I'm leaving for Houston, whether you like it or not. So if you want to make something happen, you better get a trade done with them, because if you don't, then I'm going to leave and you're not going to get anything in return. So the Clippers had to make that deal. Chris Paul, everybody talks about, D Wade and LeBron being so close. Chris Paul and Carmelo Anthony are incredibly close. They're very, very close. And the first thing that I heard once it was official that Chris Paul was going to Houston, within 30 minutes, I learned that Carmelo Anthony was on the Houston Rockets' radar, because that's what they were talking about, their own version of Big Three in Melo, Chris Paul, and James Harden in Houston. Obviously, it takes a lot more to get things done with Melo, and you can blame Melo to some degree for that. Remember, when I broke the story in 2010 that LeBron was going to South Beach, one of the things that I reminded everybody of, it was never supposed to be Bosh, D. Wade, and LeBron. It was supposed to be LeBron, D. Wade, and Melo. But Melo, 3 years earlier, had decided to take the 5-year deal as opposed to the 3-year deal, and then opt out in 2010 because he wanted his $80 million guaranteed from Denver. He didn't want to take the chance of, opting out and seeing what happens. And that's why he didn't end up in Miami, which is why ultimately he tried to get to New York. Now you find yourself in a different scenario where CP3 is free and free to join James Harden. But once again, Melo needs the assistance of the team he plays for in order to get things done, because Melo wanted that $124 million contract. So that's what the situation is right now. It's a challenge to get things done, and who knows what's going to happen. Some other team can come into the mix as well. But as of yesterday, I'm telling you that Cleveland and Houston are the teams on Carmelo Anthony's radar, according to numerous league sources, and it's pretty locked in that regard. Cleveland and Houston, unless something else develops, and I don't know what that could be at this particular moment in time.
All right, he's Stephen A., and we're just never going to let him rest. Go back to your vacation. Thank you very much, Steve, for jumping. I really appreciate it. He tweeted at us, and I needed to get some answers, and we wound up getting a lot more than even I expected. Go ahead, Will.
Just to not bury, quick. Yeah, not to bury the lead here, but it's no mistake that he calls in during my segment with you and eats up all my time. That's what that was about.
The best of Mike and Mike.
Here she is, the star of The Six. Jemele Hill has made her way here with a fantastic T-shirt. I mean, Ice Cube is like the most. That movie was on. She's got a T-shirt from Boys in the Hood, and when I saw it, I remember the movie from the theaters, and obviously I loved it when you guys did the parody of the climactic final
my 40
scene,
drinking was superb,
which was tremendous.
That was maybe the best 40 drinking in the history of this network and probably any network.
I had practice, so it was good.
But if someone had told you when NWA first burst onto the scene, that guy is going to have the most diverse professional resume of any entertainer in Hollywood, which I think you could argue right now he does. Now he's running the 3-on-3 basketball league and everything. I mean, it's remarkable what he's doing.
That was an interesting transition to see Cube go from obviously his role as a performer and as an artist to being Are We There Yet? I think that's the name of the movie. Be making kids movies. Like, if you would have told me Ice Cube was going to go on to do that, making family movies, I just would have thought you were completely crazy.
I mean, you brought him up earlier this morning.
I always said it's going to be the wildest thing, that they're going to be a generation of kids that only know him as that. Like, that's scary. Like that's the guy from Ride Along, or that's the guy from Are We There Yet? Or that's the guy who was the angry black police chief from 21 Jump Street.
Right.
Like, it's all of these things that just run so counter to what the rest of us were used to for a while.
There's wild times. Welcome to 2017.
All right, let's jump into everything here. We just had Stephen A. on. I'm not sure if you had a chance to hear it, but he was talking about Carmelo would be willing to take a buyout to go to Cleveland. not so much for Houston. That would have to be a trade. But he was saying Melo and Chris Paul are that kind of close. And from basically the instant Chris Paul got himself to Houston, the conversation about Carmelo started heating up. So what is your big picture sense? Let's start with this. Carmelo to Cleveland, Carmelo to Houston. Which to you is the better fit and the more significant threat to Golden State?
I would probably say Carmelo to Cleveland. And look, LeBron James, I mean, as we know, he's still in the prime of his career. I think that he will bring out something in Melo, like some of the criticisms Melo has faced throughout his career. We know he's a dynamic offensive player, but in terms of being a complete player and maybe even being to some degree for the first time in his career, if they play together, a role player, if you will, I think that's a really good fit for him. But I'm just still not sure, like as much as we've been fantasizing about the Banana Boat brothers coming together, I'm not sure if they all do that means that they win a title. And even if some fragmented section of the Banana Boat brothers wind up together, while again entertaining, would be a must watch every night, I don't see that being enough to beat Golden State either. Because look, Carmelo, he's a half court player in the sense that like he slows the game down. He's not a pace player. Golden State, they force you to play their pace, and we know what they can do defensively. They're one of the best defensive teams in the league. You know, they have 2 MVPs. Like, it's going to take a lot to beat them, and I just don't know if any of these combinations work to beat them.
Yeah, now we know the best version of Carmelo that we've seen is usually Carmelo in the Olympics, and that's one that he's got that experience, I think, being less than the number one scorer mentality and all that, and that's what LeBron can get out of him, because I'm with you. I think the only chance we've got at significant change here, because Chris Paul and Harden kind of cancel each other out in the way we've talked about, at least as a pairing. You add him to Cleveland, and they're the closest to Golden State. They're the most Golden State tangent. Everyone else is trying to climb over San Antonio and Cleveland first to even get a shot at that.
Right. And the other thing, too, is we have to be real. Carmelo, that Olympic player we've seen, he's not that player anymore. He's kind of on the decline, still effective. So I'm not trying to put him out the pasture necessarily, but it kind of feels like the Mayweather Pacquiao fight. It just happened a couple years too late. Would have loved to see this 3 or 4 years ago. And LeBron, it was interesting because I asked my co-host Michael Smith this. What has been a more impactful on the NBA? Golden State coming together the way they have, signing Kevin Durant specifically, or LeBron James and the way he conducts his business? And LeBron had this plan in mind years ago of always being able to control his destiny. He got Wade on board. That's how they all got to Miami. They tried to get Carmelo on board to do that, and I feel like he missed his opportunity and his window then. Because had the Banana Boat brothers happen 3 or 4 years ago, then we'd be talking about something else entirely.
Yeah, it would be like 7 years ago now if he had gone down there in the first place, and we'll see. Mike and Mike, Jamel Hill is here with us. Mike and Jamel, the Sports Center at 6 every single night. The Straight Talk brought to you by Straight Talk Wireless, best phones, best networks, no contracts. Okay, so I'm going to make an analogy that I think will be very near and dear to your youthful heart.
Okay.
Carmelo Anthony could go to Cleveland and be the microwave. That's what he could be in Cleveland. For those who don't remember the Bad Boys Pistons, people don't remember the Bad Boys Pistons as romantically, and for a lot of reasons.
Man, Vinnie Johnson, yeah.
But Vinnie Johnson coming off the bench, he was instant offense. Before that was an expression. So I'm not saying Carmelo has to come off the bench, but I'm saying there are those spots when LeBron James sits down and they all of a sudden forget how to play basketball. You give the ball to Carmelo and get out of the way. And I'm telling you right now, they will not score 0 points in a 3-minute stretch. And that alone might be the difference.
Yeah, and I would say the same if D. Wade, if Chicago gives him a buyout, which they should. Between the Knicks and the Bulls, I realize that for James Dolan, probably wrapping your mind around paying somebody something close to $50 million or whatever a small discount may be there is probably a little tough to take. But if Chicago, it makes all the sense in the world. You want to stink. So you give D Wade this buyout because he might mess around and win you some games. You let your younger players play, and then you line yourself up for a top pick in the draft. But D Wade, it would be the same thing. Instant offense, those stretches, as you said, when LeBron sits down and they don't quite have everything together, that wouldn't happen with those two. And so while I should make this clear, I think that if he got D. Wade or certainly Carmelo, they would get closer to beating Golden State. We might see that 7-game series. I just still don't think that it's necessarily enough, because people have to look at what they got from Deron Williams, which is basically nothing. So you mean to tell me Carmelo and D-Wade in that role or, in that position wouldn't give them something? They give them a lot. D-Wade still averaged 18 a game.
And with Cleveland, you've got the advantage of being able to prioritize that postseason health. They're not going to need Dwayne Wade to go out there and really give them anything in the regular season. They can get there without him. It's just plugging 1-minute gaps if you're Cleveland. And I think if you add Dwayne Wade, it still gives you room fit-wise to get someone else on the court who can give you that wing defense where they really lacked, where we really saw them get exploited by Golden State. And listen, Dwayne Wade on his best day, if the knees stay healthy and everything else, can give you some semblance of defense in that backcourt too.
In the big picture, last question for you here, and for those who didn't get a chance to see you and Mike's take on it last night. When we look back on Phil Jackson's tenure running the New York Knicks, is there anything defensible in it? Will Cain and I just had an argument. I won't even prejudice the jury by mentioning Porzingis. Do you feel inclined to defend it at all against the onslaught of criticism that he has received?
No, and when he first got to the Knicks, I knew it was a mistake from the beginning, because it just never seemed to me that Phil Jackson really was invested in the job. It requires a different level of commitment than a coach, a different level of overseeing how you do things. And I know Phil wanted to create a certain type of culture, but it's hard to create that culture when you're kind of there, you're in and out. Like, you have to commit to it. And the fact that when he was first offered the job, the offer sat so long, it just felt like something that he felt like he needed to do to prove that he could be an architect. And look, I know that there's going to be a lot of temptation for people to look at what he did, or didn't do rather, in an executive role and sort of attach that to his legacy as a coach, because there was always this question about whether Phil Jackson was really a coach or did he always just have the best players. He's faced that his whole career. But I think it's just a matter of knowing what you do best at. And knowing that there are some things you're not good at. There are some roles on television I'm not good at. People might say I'm not very good on the six. That's fine. But like, there are certain things in TV I know I can't do. That doesn't mean I'm a terrible TV person across the board. Being an executive is just not Phil's thing. And unfortunately for him, he is the latest line of people that go to the Knicks who have these reputations that seem above reproach in basketball. And by the time they leave there, you can't even believe they know anything about basketball.
And to Jamel's point, culture is a word that gets brought up a ton in sports, and it's one of those things that's hard to put your finger on, but the one thing you need if you're going to have successful, whatever your culture is buy-in with your star player. And whether you're a coach or an executive, that's the one thing, regardless of how good the guys Phil had around him, he made it work. He gelled with those guys, and he had their trust. There was never trust with Carmelo. There was never that buy-in, and when you can't have that from the beginning, and now with Kristaps, who is going to be your last-ditch effort at that at the end, you have nothing.
Sometimes it's about patience, too. For example, I was at the BT Awards weekend last weekend, and Mike and I were the announcing team for the BT Celebrity Game, which actually airs tonight, I think. And they had a concert Saturday night. It was Migos, I think Gucci Mane, A$AP Rocky. And I can just imagine right now, Greeny is looking at me like, who the hell are these people? To some degree. But as much as I like the Migos music and I like Gucci Mane, I'm not going to that concert. Like, I'm grown. Like, I'm a grown woman. Like, I'm not going to sit up there with little 17 and 18-year-olds. That's a bad mix. I would be cranky and not having a good time hanging around those people. And Phil didn't realize that the game, in many respects, had passed him by. Like, he's too old to be in an executive role because he's too cranky. That's why he's way overly honest about Carmelo. That's why it was doomed to not work.
Phil Jackson is Joe Budden in a Migos concert right now.
See what I'm saying? Yeah. Right? He's getting up and walking off like, I don't have time for this now.
First of all, I know exactly who Gucci Mane is. And second of all, and more significantly,
Gucci's my boy.
I'm not even going to excuse him on that front because Pat Riley is just as old as he is, but he is completely invested.
Totally.
He cares and he wants it. Phil Jackson took the money because he just couldn't turn it down. He never wanted any part of this, and to me, that's even worse.